Hello, hello. Welcome back. Teach from Your Soul, week 2. My name is Lisa Mitchell. Once again, thank you so much gratitude, so much appreciation for you and your desire to be here with me today. So kudos. So before we get started, let's just take a moment to really get settled into the space, wherever you are. See if you can find a nice upright seat, some elongation of the spine. So just breathe. So take a deep breath in through your nose. Open the mouth, give a nice sigh out. Try that a few more times on your own, really acknowledging the depth and the awesomeness of just deep breaths and how it can just almost immediately change our mindset, almost immediately can give us a fresh new perspective, immediately just calms the whole entire nervous system. So just enjoy those deep breaths. Try to focus on the inhales and exhales as they occur, letting that be your objects of just quieting down your thoughts, of eliminating all the other distractions of your day so that you can be open and receptive to learning. Okay, if the eyes were closed, slowly start to let them flutter open so we can begin. All righty. All right, just a reminder, just piggybacking off of Route 1 and just how important it is to keep in the forefront of your mind that to teach is to serve. So anytime we walk into that studio space or wherever it is that we're in the role of being a yoga teacher, that should be always our intention, to be of service to others, right? So just a reminder because it's that important. All right, so chakra 2, Svadhisthana, sometimes translated as sweetness. Other times you may see it translated as the dwelling place of the self. So if you recall back to chakra 1, where the element was earth, meaning like foundation and stability, now we're moving into this element of water, which makes perfect sense because the purpose of chakra 2 is about connection, it's about movement, it's about fluidity, it's about change, it's about all of those things that are very much synonymous with water. The color is orange. Now the demon, I have 2 demons actually for chakra 2 because just doing research on chakras, I've come across both of these. So it could be guilt. It can also be envy. So we will discuss that a little bit as we go on as well. The basic rights are to feel and to have pleasure. Developmental stages of when chakra 2 is in its forefront is 6 months to 2 years. But again, there are things that can happen to us at any point in our life that either create a more balanced or imbalanced chakra as well. So some of those traumas that can affect our ability to feel balanced in this chakra is sexual abuse, rejection, coldness, meaning like lack of affection perhaps as a child or in a different stage of life, overuse of playpen or any other type of confinement that perhaps you experienced as a youngster, physical abuse, alcoholism in family. There's a high incident of creating some disruption in a nice balanced chakra there. If you had any denials of expression, if you were kind of taught to hold your feelings in or not to express your emotions, that can definitely play a role, as well as any other volatile situations. So if we're looking for balance characteristics in Svadhisthana and chakra 2, there's this level of emotional intelligence. There's an ability to experience pleasure without feelings of guilt or without feelings of envy. There is some nurturance of yourself, as well as being able to be very nurturing to others. And there's an ability to change. This concept of just being able to go with the flow and just being changeable is also a very balanced characteristic, chakra 2. Gracefulness in movements, because when you think about fluidity, if you're very graceful in your body and all of that, then that is a nice balanced characteristic. And just overall having healthy boundaries with other people in your relationships, etc. All right, so a Svadhisthana deficiency is a denial of pleasure. So if you're denying yourself an opportunity to have some pleasure in your life, or if you're constantly feeling guilty around it, that can definitely be a deficiency. So frigidity, a fear of change, if there's a lack of passion or desire in your life, if you have poor social skills, and if you have a very rigid body type or very rigid attitude, that is also sometimes presents itself as a deficiency. And then, of course, we have our excesses, where this could be considered like any type of sexually acting out. So like, not just a normal or healthy or traditional sexual relationship, but just acting out sexually, that can be perceived as negative for yourself or for others. Excessively strong emotions, so being overly sensitive in terms of your emotions, having poor boundaries or seeming very invasive of others, like kind of lacking that, just being very almost like demanding of others. Also seductive or being manipulative. If there's an addiction to pleasure, and pleasure can be so many different things, but if there's ever an excess, would be almost like that addiction where it's just never enough. That would definitely be an excess chakra 2, as well as emotional dependency. All right, so before we get into the teaching tips, I'll just give you a little bit more background information about chakra 2. Chakra 2 is definitely considered a feminine energy center. So not only does it deal with connection and flow and change, but it's also this like core of our creativity, as well as sexuality and pleasure and all of those wonderful things. So when this chakra is out of balance, there's a lot of just emotional instability, right? There's all of this fear around change. There's sometimes depression, there's sometimes addictions, there's sometimes sexual dysfunctions, right? So when we have this balanced second chakra, we have this feeling of just overall wellness, abundance, pleasure, joy, all of these, wonderful things that we strive for in our lives. So with considering ourselves as yoga teachers, this really does play a vital role in just our own creativity as a yoga teacher, but it also helps to really facilitate and develop and maintain this essence of having healthy relationships with your students as well as your peers. So in its natural state, Svadhisthana brings us a very joyful and spontaneous expression through lots of different activities like dance, it could be movement, it could be art, things that we find to be creative, things that we find to be joyful and pleasurable, because the nature of the chakra is really to be about seeking new experiences and having new challenges, because at the intensity of it all, it's our creative nature that is constantly seeking external stimulation, right? So this is why we do the things that we do to find this stimulation, to find these areas of joy and pleasure. Through its relationship to water, there's this flexible aesthetic to it. It has a very inventive nature. So it helps us really adapt to just new situations, and this going along with like feeling balanced and being changeable. So like water can help us move over, under, or around our obstacles. So if this energy, this chakra becomes blocked or congested, that's where we start to, have a more difficult time creating positive change and experience, certain patterns of behavior that really cause us to feel very stuck, like we're stuck in this like cycle that we just can't really break free from. And this cycle is not one that is loving or makes you feel as though you deserve, or maybe it's subconsciously or consciously holding on to just fears that really prevent us from being our very best self or living up to our fullest potential. So the second chakra, as I mentioned before, is really concerned with our right to feel. So a main challenge for this chakra comes from the conditioning of our society, right? When you think about our society, we live in a place where oftentimes our feelings are not valued, where passion and emotional reactions are often frowned upon. We are taught that we shouldn't lose control. We are taught often to be disconnected from our bodies and our feelings, right? And this plays an enormous impact. Culturally, this can have an enormous impact on how we learn to deal with our emotions. And I think about this a lot, particularly for men, who we often make feel as though they can't express their emotions, like they have to repress themselves. At the same time, women are criticized for being weak or overly dramatic when they don't repress theirs. So it's kind of like this catch-22 when it comes to this emotional state that we're kind of that's culturally embedded upon us. But the suppression of feelings and the suppression of our emotions really only serves to keep us out of touch with our own emotional intelligence, and really just takes away from this right to feel, which is such a crucial part of chakra 2. But there can be compromise, right? So we can have compromise in this. If you were taught to express yourself freely, or that your thoughts and your feelings are validated, and you have this feeling that you're listened to, because if not, if we're taught the opposite, that our feelings are wrong or irrational, or that we're taught to keep our feelings inside, that's where it's like the water doesn't have this opportunity to change and to move, and that's where we kind of get really stuck and blocked in this area. So in order for us to find healing in this place of feeling stuck, the movement and the change has to occur, right? We have to allow it to occur. It can't be stagnant water. That's never good, right? So the purpose of the chakra is to get things moving. Without movement, there is no change. Without movement, there is no evolution, right? Have you ever had an experience that can be described as really moving, right? So we have this somewhere in our subconscious, we have this understanding. We use it in language, right? Like, oh my God, I was so moved by that movie. Oh, that was so touching. I was so moved by, the things he was saying to her, or whatever. It could be anything, but you can clearly get an understanding of when you feel moved by an experience, right? You can easily see how connected our emotions are to this intuitive sense of movement. But it is through stimulation and passion, the fluidity and movement of the second chakra, that we can really harness the chakras above us, particularly when we get to chakra 3. So without that movement, without that ability to be changeable, then we kind of get stuck here, and we don't have that opportunity to move higher through the more higher chakras, if that makes sense. Okie dokie. All right, so now into these teaching tips, piggybacking off of, if you watch Teach From Your Soul, my free course, Get Moving. Get moving. This can mean so many different things, but more pertinent to chakra 2 in terms of being a yoga teacher is for you to get moving off of your own yoga mat into the role of the teacher, mingling around the room, really fostering that sense of connection. So getting away from standing in the front of the room and leading the class from afar, versus being in the mix of it all and really being a teacher to the students that show up, right? So that can take some practice. Sometimes our yoga mat in the front of the room, if that's how we were trained, if that's how we were taught to teach, can feel like our security blanket, right? That's like kind of like our own comfortable space. It's easier to be, leading the class from up there in your own little bubble. It's easier to do all the movements, to demo everything so that people know exactly what you're trying to do, versus really speaking to, the people that are showing up. And there's really only one way to speak to whoever is present, by being able to look at them, to be able to connect with them. And it's very difficult to do that from the very front of the room, where you have a limited range of moment, a limited gazing point. You can only get but so involved if you're not off of your mat. So I encourage you all to get moving, to not feel as though you're one spot as a yoga teacher is in the front of the room on your personal yoga mat, and instead you get off. And yes, it does require you to be vulnerable. It does take a little bit of practice. It may force you to have to make some eye contact and smile, but it's honestly, you're going to see just an overload of your ability to be connected when you're off of your mat and you're really mingling around the room. In addition, it will fine tune your words so that your cues become so spot on that they don't really even need a visual most of the time. I very rarely have to demo anything unless I'm teaching like some, obscure posture that isn't like very common in a yoga class, like an arm balance or something like that. That's, a little bit more rarely taught. But other than that, it's my words that guide people step by step. So even if it doesn't feel natural, just like with anything in your life, the more you do it, the more you practice, the more natural it becomes, right? So if you're getting disoriented when you walk off your mat, if you feel as though you can't keep track of your flow or your sequence, there's a few things that you can do to just get yourself back together. For one, just take a couple deep breaths for yourself. Get yourself centered. just like we mentioned when we started, sometimes we forget the intensity of just a few deep breaths, right? To just get your mind right. So stopping to do that is always an option. If you have notes, or if you have, your flow written down like somewhere that you can kind of sneak over and take a peek as you need to. And honestly, most of the time I find that teachers don't even need to be taking a peek. I feel like if they're practicing their flow and they're embracing it in their own bodies first, they know it feels good. But if you need to see your notes, then go take a peek at your notes, right? You can have the class be in child's pose while you get over this little mental lapse if you forget where you are or forget what you're doing. You can have them hang out in downward facing dog, because that's also a place that we have a few moments of wiggle room where they can find some stillness to themselves, right? And when all else fails, just make a joke out of the situation. You can, jokingly say, I'm completely lost, and laugh it off and just keep it moving, right? Keep it flowing. If you say it apologetically, if you're like, I'm sorry, then that's where we have that issue where, there's an opportunity to lose a little bit of trust, where they start to devalue that what you're doing, and they start to devalue you a little bit as a yoga teacher. But we're only human. Everybody makes mistakes. And a lot of times the class doesn't even notice the things that are so distracting and so heart-wrenching for us, right? Most of the time, they're not even noticing those things. So it's okay to laugh at yourself. It's okay to have a mistake that's handled in a very lighthearted fashion. I'm definitely more of a proponent of keeping things light. It's yoga. It's not brain surgery. As much as I love yoga and I absolutely value it as such a huge part of my life, it's basically the forefront of everything that I do. But at the same time, we make mistakes, and it's just a yoga class, right? So don't beat yourself up about that. And keep it simple. Sometimes we overcomplicate things, and we try to have these crazy, intricate, sequences that are really unnecessary, especially if you're a newer teacher. It is hard to put out the words of a flow. It really is, where you're keeping your class on track. So start with sequences that maybe only have 2 or 3 postures linked at a time. For example, warrior 1 or warrior 2 to a triangle. And then you transition to the other side with a vinyasa, right? So you're way more likely to forget what you've done and in which order when you move on, if you don't stack too many poses on top of each other, right? It's also important that we balance both sides equally, which can be hard when you start to give too many instructions all at once, right? So sometimes this can lead you to tell everything that you know about something on the right side, because that's generally like the first side that we do. And then you have nothing left to say on the left side. So inevitably they're either awkwardly holding the pose or they're not holding the pose nearly as long enough. So I try to even out the cues that I give from one side to the next. And I have a simple method from the way that I do that is that I cue from the ground up. And this is always an effective way to cue your class, right? So starting from the ground up. So say for the first side, I may address your feet placement, maybe your legs and your hips, right? And then on the other side, I'm going to build from there. So maybe I'll address the torso, the rib cage, the lift of the belly, right? So any of those things could be one aspect of that. Maybe I talk a little bit about your arms and maybe lengthening and, pulling the pinky edges of your fingers in towards the center, whatever. Maybe I talk about the gaze, right? So they are completely different cues from one side to the next. And it really helps me keep track of how many cues I'm giving on one side to the next, which helps me keep the equality of how long we're holding from right side to left side. Because we all have experienced that, where the hold seems like it's forever on the right side because the teacher's giving you so much information. Because a lot of times when we're new to teaching, that we want to feel like we know what we're talking about. So we say everything that we know about every single posture, which is really unnecessary. Because again, if you go back to looking around the room and moving around and seeing people as they are, then a lot of times we say things that are unnecessary anyway. And then when I go to the next side, I give that same amount of cues, which give or take is going to give me the same amount of time in a hold, right? There's other things that you can do. You can count breaths. You can count your own breaths. You can breathe with the class. I've seen teachers have a clock that has a second hand, you know, like whatever works for you, right? Whatever works for you. But I think it all comes down to being in motion and to being connected to the students. And sometimes that connection is, sometimes it's just so intuitive. If you have a group of students that are, you know, you've been holding something for so long that half the room has already released the posture, then that is your cue, like, okay, like let's move on. You know, we have to keep it moving, right? So it all kind of comes down to that one. But just remember that all teachers make mistakes sometimes. Even our super famous teachers, even teachers that write books, even teachers that are, you know, all over Instagram, we all make mistakes, and no one's, you know, holding us, you know, so accountable for that. It happens now and then, so don't beat yourself up. All right, so not only do we have to get moving, but we have to get the class moving, right? So do not neglect to offer Surya Namaskars or sun salutations, right? So this may be stylistic. So if you teach like a flow or a vinyasa class, you know, then obviously sun salutations or some type of breath and movement is probably already an integral part of your class. So if you teach a style that doesn't include that, then maybe this will pertain to you, maybe not. But I find it very important to offer sun salutations to really get that element of fluidity and movement into your own student's body. So as you may or may not know, sun salutations consist of set sequences of yoga postures. They're traditionally done in the earlier part of a yoga practice, even though you can obviously infuse them throughout. But it is definitely an opportunity to have the class really moving, to link the breath into movement, to create that internal fire within their own selves. So sun salutations have so many benefits. They really do enhance physical strength. But more importantly for me, I feel like sun salutations really prepare the students for everything else that's to follow, right? So without a proper warm-up, without that ability to get into their bodies and breathe and move, there's just going to be a higher risk of yoga-related injuries, right? Because if, as a rule of thumb, you know, sun salutations should be performed for about 1/10 of your total practice. So if you had an hour class, about 10 minutes of that or so should be sun salutations. Right? It's a crucial part of preparing the body for everything else that's to come in the practice. But I also am such an avid believer that sun salutations alone can truly prepare you for everything else that comes in your day. It is a time, like sometimes we refer to this as almost like a meditation in motion or even a moving meditation. I find it so important. If you're a yoga teacher and you don't have a firm grasp of sun salutations, if you don't have it memorized, if you don't feel it and know it in your body 100%, at any moment of the day, someone can say, stop, drop, and teach me sun salutations. You should be able to do it. No doubt, it's a very integral part of being a yoga teacher, and I really stress that with my students all the time. All right, so if you're energetically referring back to the koshas, I also included the little bit of kosha explanation as part of our bonuses from last week, so you can review that as you want. Chakra 1 corresponds with Annamaya kosha, which is really the periphery of the body, whereas Chakra 2 integrates a layer that's a little bit deeper. This is where we get into the Pranamaya kosha. So Pranamaya kosha allows for more freedom in the body, where the practitioner can then really focus on breath exploration, particularly with the coordination of breath and body. So you can see how that really does coincide with sun salutations. So moving through sun salutations is a highly effective way to foster this synchronization of our physical body to our breath body, Annamaya kosha with Pranamaya kosha, right? So if sun salutations are done in the vinyasa style with a linking of one breath per movement, it can provide not only that linking of physical to breath, but also it's a great cardiovascular experience, right? The complexity of these movements of Surya Namaskar with a concentration of focus and breath, it's really just an amazing, amazing thing. After all, the whole goal of the yoga practice is to eliminate unnecessary thoughts and mind chatter. So sun salutations is a time that the student can really, you know, tune into nothing else about this breath and movement. So there's so many benefits of having a consistent practice of sun salutations. I mean, just that cardiovascular nature really does improve functions of the heart rate, the liver, the intestines, the stomach, the throat, the chest. legs. It purifies blood flow throughout the body. Basically, partaking in sun salutations is like a whole body tune-up. Think about getting a tune-up in your car. Think about sun salutations as your tune-up for your body. So adding sun salutations to the earlier portion of a class really gets people connected to their bodies and their breaths. It creates that internal heat of the practice, as I mentioned before, because it's this heat that purifies the body and purifies the mind. So in my opinion, neglecting to add sun salutations to your class is really like neglecting your students' practices, right? For all the reasons that I mentioned. It's really just a way to prepare for everything else that's coming, right? So you may be familiar with Patabi Joyce. He's the founder of Ashtanga Yoga. And he said, you know, his famous little quote was, practice and all is coming, right? If we practice, all is coming. But in modern worlds, we can morph this very easily to say, practice because all is coming, right? Everything is coming, all is coming. But because of that, we need to practice. Like the good days are coming, the bad days are coming. It's all going to be there for us because all of this is coming. And that's why we practice. And that is why I love my sun salutations. All righty. So we're moving. Be creative in your teaching, right? As I mentioned before, the second chakra encourage us to be playful and a little exploratory as a yoga teacher. This creative energy, however, is best expressed when it builds from the stable ground of the root chakra, right? So therefore, before getting creative and expressive with your postures and your sequences, be sure to offer stability in the body, breath, and mind. It is only then that the class can be receptive to anything that feels unfamiliar, right? So never neglect that opportunity for grounding before they start to flow, as we mentioned from week 1. Once you establish that ability to have them feel centered and steady in their base, then you can allow that creativity to flow. Those creative juices that can really come out, especially if you're teaching, you know, a class that's not necessarily a set sequence, but you can definitely be creative in a set sequence class, creative in your words, creative in just the insight that you offer. But of course, you know, more specifically, there is definitely a creative element in how you sequence and flow. Sequences, as much as they can be creative, they also have to be logical and they have to be intelligent. You can't just mishmash a bunch of your favorite poses together and think that it's going to work. There's actually a science to it, right? So a couple things to think about in terms of creativity and sequencing. Notice if your postures are moving from simple to complex. Are you allowing for both ha and ta, right? When we think of hatha yoga, which is really the emphasis and the basis of all the physical postures, we're really representing the ha, the sun, and the ta, the moon, right? It kind of comes back to that feeling of strength and ease that they talk about in the Yoga Sutras, that sthira sukha in your asana, that steadiness and ease in your poses. So are you including elements of that? Is there an element of sun and moon energy? Is there an element that they're working really hard and working really strong, but also have an essence of ease and flow in their practice, right? Does your sequence support inner awareness and presence for your students? Are you creating a well-rounded class that includes all the various groups of poses with a focus on equal parts strength, flexibility, and balance, right? So these are all things that you have to think about. Are you moving the spine in all directions? Flexion, extension, side bending, twist, right? Because it's very rare in our day-to-day lives that we have an opportunity to move our spine in all of those directions. So I always feel that a yoga class should have all the directions of the spine accommodated for. If any of these answers to these questions are unclear, consider approaching your class structure in a slightly different way. So I'm going to include a basic template as part of the bonuses for this week. That is just kind of like a way that if you can include these components with obviously lots of flexibility, lots of room for change. You could very easily swap out one pose for another in the same category to keep things interesting. But I'm going to give you guys my go-to formula, which will have students feeling as though they're getting a full and complete practice. But you can obviously expand upon what I'm offering you. But I'll just kind of go through it quickly. But again, I'm going to have it laid out for you in the bonuses. So as I mentioned before, you need that centering. You need that time to bring the students into the space. After some centering, some warm up. So this isn't sun salutations yet. This is gentle stretching to awake the body. So this could be cat and cows. This could be thread the needle. This could be maybe a couple, baby cobra poses. It could be neck rolls. It could be gentle twists. I mean, there's so many things that you can do that gently start to awaken the body in preparation for everything else. And once you have that opportunity, which is also that nice opportunity to tap into some breath and movement coordination, then you give them that full on breath and movement experience, the sun salutations, right? These can be varied and infused. But I say traditional is usually perfect enough. You don't have to make it fancy. You can teach a traditional sun salutation A, a traditional sun salutation B. You don't have to add a crazy amount of variations. They're good just the way they are. In fact, they are perfect just the way they are. All right, so after all that, they may need a water break, depending. But then we get into the standing sequence, right? So this includes not only your warriors and all of that, but it includes balancing postures. If you are going to do arm balances at this point, this is where you can kind of start to infuse them because they are properly warmed up. Their bodies are, a little bit more open and ready for that. Some back bend sequences would also kind of be coming afterwards. Core is optional. Some people like core in their yoga classes. Some people do not. So if you are going to have core, I would probably piggyback that sometime after back bends. And then, of course, we have our lovely hip openers, where now we're kind of teetering more towards the end of class, where it's more towards the cool down. There should always be some forward folds, some type of twist, whether it's seated, whether it's reclined, perhaps some cooling inversions if you want shoulder stand or legs up a wall. And then you're getting to your shavasana. So again, that's very basic bones of a yoga class. There's so much that you can do just from following those simple steps. So more information on that if you check out the bonuses. So there's definitely a possibility that you want to be creative in your flow and you want to teach with the intention of a peak pose, right? So peak poses can be pretty badass. They're a very cool way to sequence a class. It does a variety of things. Peak poses can really introduce students to a variety of asanas while showing them an intelligent path to get there. It's like a path that they build on to get to this peak posture that you're slowly kind of warming the body in preparation for throughout the class. So once you have a pose in mind, if you want to make a peak pose flow, you need to consider what needs to be warmed up, engaged, and taught for your students to find some success in this apex of the class, like this peak of the class where the pose will be approached. So many students like the thrill of working towards a goal, and they really value learning something specific and trying new things. So just know that that's something that a lot of people can agree with. Be sure to pick a pose that's appropriate for the general level of the class, especially if you're teaching classes that are considered all levels, which is a trend that I'm finding more and more across studios. So here are some thoughts to consider when you're planning a peak pose class. Right, so your peak pose, generally it's challenging. It may be the most challenging pose of the class, but it should not be impossible, right? It should not be absolutely impossible to approach. Make sure everyone has a stage of the final pose that's appropriate to them so no one feels left out. Have you ever been to a yoga class where there's some practitioners doing really cool, fancy things as they're led by the teacher, and there's some people just literally sitting there watching other people? That's what we do not want to happen. So no matter what posture is your peak, there should be something that everyone can do that will give a similar benefit to what the peak pose is. So take time to really think about what your students will need to access the pose. And then you design a class that will enable them to cultivate whatever that is. So try to teach to key actions and alignment principles, rather only simple shapes of postures. So aim to ensure that you've opened the key muscle groups that are necessary, right? If someone just didn't prepare me for a compass pose or something like that, and all of a sudden it's like, hey, it's compass pose, that's a way different experience than someone that really built you up and included other body parts in preparation of getting to that. So you want to build your pose in a logical and progressive way, and you want to make sure you leave enough time to do the appropriate counter poses in order to prepare people to be able to rest it out in Shavasana. So other things that you can do that are considered peak in some ways, it's not necessarily a peak pose, but you can also teach a particular anatomical area of the body, whether this is your hips, whether it's your shoulders, whether you're focusing on hamstrings or whatever. And this can be a very creative offering to a class, right? Not everybody has an anatomy mind, but a lot of people do like to learn new things about their bodies and the way it moves. So there's nothing wrong with that. It's definitely a sure way for students to feel a sense of activation and engagement in a particular part of their body. So that's always a nice thing. However, there still needs to be balance, right? You still need to have the class feel full and complete. So if you're only touching on body parts that are specific to one anatomical emphasis, they're not going to feel full and complete. So if you have a shoulder class, for example, but all you do is focus on shoulder opening and shoulder stretching and shoulder whatever, and you never get to any other body parts, you're going to feel like it's just not going to have that feeling of balance. You're going to feel that something's missing. There's some lack there. Right. So just being mindful of that. There can truly be so much creativity involved in class sequencing. I mean, sequencing is probably one of the reasons why I love teaching Vinyasa yoga so much. But with such creativity, there is so much room for error. So if you're striving for balance in a class, you likely will make your students happy if you kind of give them a full experience. So balancing a yoga class is really an art, right? To become stronger in your craft and teaching, we have to have some simple guidelines that we follow to help find some balance, right? So being mindful that you're spending as much time strengthening the back of the body as you spend on the front, right? So just notice that when you're teaching. Take the time to stretch many areas of the bodies like the chest, the shoulders, the hip flexors, as these are often areas that are overused and understretched. So make sure you have some time in some grounded and seated postures, right? As these often mirror our standing poses and aid in the class cool down, right? So we do so many forward folds, standing forward folds in our practice that, when we do it in a seated, more grounded situation towards the end of class, then we're just kind of mirroring and building off of places that we've already been. So try to facilitate some quiet introspection, right? Some level of humbleness into your practice, right? This balances out this on-the-go energy that exists in most of our lives off of the mat. So given some chance for introspection, and that can look and feel like so many different things. And don't cheat their Shavasana. Some yogis consider this to be the most important posture of all. Shavasana really allows the body to heal and has many meditative qualities. So make sure you hold and honor this important space for your students. Don't cheat them. I mean, 5 minutes, 5 minutes is not a lot of time, but if you give them less than 5 minutes, they're going to feel it. They're going to notice it. And it's almost like you're cheating them that opportunity to really let the practice integrate into their whole being. So in terms of creativity, keep in mind that new teachers often feel pressured to constantly change their sequences. More experienced teachers stay creative, but focus on keeping aspects of the class more consistent for students. From my experience, most students prefer a certain amount of routine with just enough variation to keep things feeling fresh and alive. So I recommend for a new teacher, maybe in your first year of teaching or so, make only minimal changes to your flow, if any, right? So I've done trainings where I was taught set sequences, and this is the flow you'll teach for your first year, and it doesn't deviate. Now, if you have an understanding of sequencing, which those teacher trainings didn't really focus so much on sequencing because it was more just about memorizing a flow, but if you have a component of sequencing, then I would say that like maybe your middle portion of your class, those standing balances and your just whole the intense part of your class, I think can stay solid for maybe that first year with minimal change at all. But sometimes just changing how you warm up or changing your cool down or, something minor like that will give the class and the students a fresh new feel. And, you won't feel like you're just being so rote in your teaching. But some of the biggest styles of yoga, when you think of Bikram or Ashtanga, whatever your thoughts are around those is a whole other story. But some of the biggest genres of yoga practice are set sequences. So there's nothing wrong with feeling like your flow is enough and that you have to change everything every time. It's just going to give more room for error, especially as a new teacher. Alrighty. Moving right along, be changeable. Like I mentioned before, the chakra's element is water. And so many great teachings come from water as being adaptable. It is a fluid form. It doesn't resist obstacles. It just kind of makes its way around them. Without effort, water has an ability to just adjust its shape, its direction, and really just, go with the flow is like the easiest way to describe it. There's this Bruce Lee video that I love where he's talking about being like water. That is his main concept of this little video. You can look it up on YouTube probably pretty easily, where he's just like, be like water. Be willing to leave aspects out of your planned sequence if you realize they may be too challenging for your group, or add in something more advanced if you think people are up for it. So I kind of talked a little bit about this in our first week, but you really have to be ready for anything to happen, right? You'll experience so many different things in your teaching worlds. There's sometimes noises being emitted from people's bodies. You got to go with the flow. I've seen body parts hanging out of people's clothes. You got to go with the flow with that too. One time we had our toilet overflow with not pretty water in the middle of class, and we all had to get up and roll our mats up and run out the door. We got to go with the flow of that too. See, these are all things that you just have to be fluid, flexible, and really just be open and ready for anything. I mean, I could go on and on about stories of things that have happened in just my years of teaching and studio ownership. So my advice for you is keep it moving and be open and ready for everything. All righty. So up next, we have teach with joy. How wonderful is that? If you're not having fun or radiating joy when you're teaching, then it starts to feel just like another chore, right? Yoga teacher burnout is an absolute real thing, right? So I often wonder when I start to see this, I start to see over time that not everyone, but a lot of times yoga teachers kind of lose that sense of inner joy. And I think so much of it has to do with a lack in their personal practice, right? So just notice that if that ever comes up for you, if you're starting to feel like you're in a rut, that you're starting to lose this joy and passion, then just kind of do a little check-in. What's going on with my own practice? Because without your practice, your teaching enthusiasm will not last long. So many teachers struggle with finding balance between teaching and practicing. And there have been many times in my own teaching career that I found that my own practice was slipping away. So I have a few simple guidelines for you to call upon in case you ever come up with that struggle on your own. So find a teacher whose classes and teaching style really resonate with you. Go to those classes as often as you can, right? Just get on your mat. Like some days you might practice for an hour, other days maybe it's 15 minutes, but both practices have benefits. So don't feel badly about a shorter practice. Sometimes it just is what it is. Instead, be grateful that you're able to be on your mat at all. So much of our own struggles and our own obstacles is really just about the way we think and the stories that we tell ourselves. I have a friend who some days can't get on her mat for extended practice, but she'll just sit on her mat to drink her morning coffee. And for her, that is her on her mat in whatever capacity it can be for that day. And even just being on her mat to drink coffee is better than not being on her mat at all, right? So it can be as simple as that. But I definitely think that a routine and creating a consistent time of the day that you practice is very, very important. It very much is. And the reality is that sometimes you just can't make it to class. I mean, I own 3 yoga studios, and most of my practice is on my own, whether I'm in the studio alone, whether I'm in my bedroom practicing, whether I'm downstairs, wherever I can do it, I do it. But, it's hard to actually make a physical class. It's like a treat for me to make a physical class. So having a home practice is important for me. And when you have a home practice, try to have a designated place for it. I have the 2 spots, either my living room or my bedroom. I'm putting it out into the world. I'm manifesting that I will have my own yoga space in my house eventually, but I think I have to wait for my children to get up out of here first. But anyway, that's a whole other story. But when you have your mat and all your props in a place that is accessible, like if I know I'm doing an early morning practice, I'll have everything set up the night before. So my mat, my blocks, my water bottle, whatever I need is already there. And just that little bit of just preparation makes a world of difference. It really, really does. It only takes a couple seconds to set those things up, but the fact that I wake up and it's already there is just so much more of a motivation to get me on the mat. All right. So as yoga teachers, we're not just sharing information about alignment and posture. There's so much more that we're sharing. We're actually sharing about how we are, like a way of being, right? So maintaining your practice is the easiest way to teach with joy and enthusiasm. So commit to your practice, right? It will not only help you keep that joy and enthusiasm, but it's going to make you feel nourished and revived when you teach. So 100%, absolutely. All right. So last but not least, but so important, we need to learn people's names, right? This is good advice for everyone, but it's particularly important for those that have opened themselves up to being teachers. Because the reality is that people love to hear their names. They feel acknowledged, they feel known, they feel valued, right? There's even a ton of research on this topic of just learning people's names. And the research really suggests that when a teacher knows the names of his or her students, it improves their overall climate of the class or studio atmosphere. People also love when you ask and remember details about their lives. I'm not suggesting by any means that you stalk your students' social media or you have to know their entire life by heart, because that could be creepy. But do ask how their day was, what they do for a living perhaps, or their vacation plans, or whatever, if they have any pets, whatever, excuse me. And once you have gathered this information, it's nice to expand upon it once in a while, right? So if you know that, they have a bulldog, then maybe, a couple times after you see them, you bring up the bulldog. How's that bulldog doing? Whatever, they just went to Florida to visit their grandma. You could say, how was your trip? Those types of things really create community and connection and really like this sense of reciprocity and value in a community. Absolutely. So I definitely am a proponent of that. I think that one of the greatest feedbacks that I get as a studio owner is that sense of community and connection. And people say it to me all the time, and sometimes I don't even, kind of realize that this is so prevalent for people, but they'll say, oh my God, I miss your studio so much. I can't seem to find any place like it, or any type of community like you've created. And it's really just about being friendly and learning people's names and being, somehow involved in their life in some small way. It makes a big difference. It makes people feel very loved and very important. So I'm definitely a fan of that. But all that to say, there definitely is this element that you have to maintain healthy boundaries with the students that you come to your classes, right? So sometimes, a yoga teacher may become more than friends, or more than first name basis with their practitioners. Meaning you may gather socially outside of the studio, but there definitely has to be a clear distinction between the student-teacher relationship, in my opinion, once other relationships start to develop, right? I don't know. Sometimes it creates a very energetic imbalance, in my opinion. So you have to be considerate of that. You have to consider that when you're a yoga teacher, you're holding that safe space, right? I mean, we talked about holding space for people. So you're holding that safe space for a student to learn and grow in this yogic path. So when you enter into more personal relationship with the students, boundaries can become blurred very, very quickly. For example, if you spend an hour with your therapist describing in-depth details of an issue from your past, then met him or her late night for some drinks, it could create enormous confusion for both parties, right? Not just for you, but also for the therapist. You might not even feel safe going back to that therapist, as now the value of what they offer to you has somewhat diminished through a very casual exchange. And that's just the blunt reality of it. I've struggled with this quite a bit. I mean, I've never dated my students. I'm married and all that, but I encounter so many amazing individuals through my experience as a yoga teacher, but I have to be mindful of not blurring my relationship with them as their yoga teacher or their teacher trainer through friendships and through casual exchange, right? So I can't, in the role that I am, I can't really look to my students and in my classes or my teacher training programs as people that are appeasing my social needs. There has to be this aspect of my social life that does remain separate in some ways, right? So I'm very mindful about this and about details that I share with my students. I just find that in so many other professions, if you're a teacher and you cross a line with your students, you would absolutely be fired. You could lose your credentialing. You can so many things, and that doesn't really exist in yoga. Unfortunately, it doesn't really exist, and so many boundaries do get crossed unnecessarily and sadly and very hurtfully, that I think it's important to have this discussion. So in terms of intimate sexual relationship with students, I suggest steer clear from that shit, right? Because as I mentioned before, in any other profession, you have a sexual relationship with your student, you're done, but yet in our life, in our profession, sexual transgressions happen all the time. And, I don't know. So my advice is, if you truly, truly believe that you have found the one, the love of your life, your soulmate has showed up into your class, I would definitely recommend that you not be macking on them in the studio space, right? The studio that you teach in or you work in or whatever is not the place to be getting phone numbers or, flirting around. It's definitely not. That should be done outside of the studio, because you're keeping the integrity of the space. You're keeping integrity of the community that has been created at the studio. But if that is the case and you guys meet at a separate location to discuss the fact that you guys are into each other, I would advise that person no longer take your class, your public classes, right? So that you are no longer the role of the teacher, right? And that is going to be my advice for you. Enough said. But I'll say it one more time, that if you find the love of your life that comes to your yoga classes and you guys decide to move forward into some type of intimate or sexual relationship, then I would 100% let you know that they should no longer be your student in a public class. They just shouldn't. And that's all I'm going to say about that. Alrighty. But of course, if you have further questions, you know how to find me. All right. So chakra 2 demon, right? Oh my goodness. Whew, this is a heavy one, right? Guilt and envy. Guilt, because so many times we feel guilty about giving ourselves some pleasure. Who else feels guilty when they go to to your favorite store and you buy a couple things for yourself? I know I feel guilty. I beat myself up about it all the time, right? So that is like unnecessary guilt. Like, we deserve to have pleasure, obviously in a balanced way. It's not like I'm going to my local Lord & Taylor every day spending hundreds of dollars, but on the occasion, if I need something or have an event to go to, I should be able to treat myself and not feel guilty about it. But I want to focus a little bit more time on envy, right? Because envy is something that really needs to be in check for yourself and for your students. The easiest way to alleviate this potential for jealousy is to celebrate the successes of others, right? And in doing so, we acknowledge their attributes as a reflection of the best parts of ourselves. I love that. In Yoga Sutra 1.33, I'm just kind of taking a small portion of the sutra, but it's one of my favorites, absolutely. So Patanjali encourages us to delight in the virtuous, meaning we should admire those who embody qualities that we wish to have and follow their example, right? Rather than harboring feelings of envy and insecurity. In this generation of Instagram yoga stars, with their graceful transitions and their, strong bodies, all of these things, it's very difficult to not have feelings of inferiority and envy. I get it, right? And I think that many people can understand this confession, that I know that many people need breaks from social media just to get their heads out of that envious place or that negative place or that constant feeling of being jealous, jealous of who attends more classes or who gets better attended classes. Remind yourself that you can't be the best teacher for everyone, and that is okay. You're not going to be everybody's cup of tea, and that is okay. Okay, but you will attract who you're supposed to attract into your classes. But I will say that adding a little bit of friendly competition into the practice has been helpful for me, right? I mean, I've been working on handstands for quite some time, and I was definitely not an expert yet. I mean, I could definitely do more if this was definitely something that was a super priority for me. I could be dedicating way more time to it, but I go in ebbs and flows of whether or not a handstand is important to me, right? But I definitely changed the way that I think about, yoga postures in general, and that's changed a lot over the years. Because I understand that asana is only 1/8 of this beautiful 8-limbed path of yoga. So I think to myself sometimes, I will use my deep, full breaths better than you. I will fall out of a handstand better than you. I will relax in Shavasana better than you. I know it's silly, but reminding myself of this keeps me consistent. And I can see more clearly that I don't need 10 more years of practice to finally get a handstand into crow pose or whatever the hell else to, to feel content is all I'm saying, right? I don't need to have my legs behind my head to feel content or to feel as though I'm doing enough, because I'm already enough, right? I'm already at a place where I'm showing up for my practice, and that's really all you have to do, right? I can be content with my practice as it is in each and every changing moment and in each and every changing breath. So what a great concept it is to remind students of that as well, because so many people come into the practice with ego, with envy, with all of those things that really just is such a huge disruption to really getting the fullest benefits of the practice. Oh yes, delight in the virtuous. Love it, love it, love it. All right, so before you teach, douse yourself with all the orange things, right? I remember when I first started getting into chakras, my closet was such a clear indicator of where I was lacking. At one point, I feel like I had there was one point in my life where I feel like everything I wore was orange. Like I was really into kind of like more earthy tones and oranges. And I feel like they do go good with my skin and all of that. But then there was a phase of my life where I was just like, everything was black and gray and there was like no bouts of color, right? So I started getting more orange things. And I think that it's really just makes a difference. It makes a difference. So anything that's orange, I'm all about it. And that can be eating an orange. It could be having a piece of dark chocolate. That does the trick. I love dark chocolate. And my newest obsession is this dark chocolate that has mandarin orange in it. Oh my Lord. That's like the double whammy of second chakra indulgences. These indulgent treats help to really stimulate your own pleasure centers in your brain and puts you into a more second chakra balanced zone, in my opinion. So try that. And just allow yourself some pleasure and don't feel guilty about it. It could be so many things, but just allowing yourself some opportunity for pleasure is key. All right, so, oops, this is a typo. I do apologize about that. This is a second chakra sequence. The postures are right. I just forgot to update this, so my apologies. Poses to include in a second chakra sequence: Supta Baddha Konasana, reclined bound angle; Ananda Balasana, happy baby; Baddha Konasana, bound angle; Upavista Konasana, seated wide-legged forward fold; Uttan Pristana, lizard lunge or lizard pose; Ekapada Kapotasana, which is the one-legged king pigeon, or any other pigeon variation that you can muster up. There's several. So if you can visualize these poses in your mind, they're very like open, like hip opening type postures, right? Because there's this association with our hips as our emotional, our center of our emotions, where we store and stack a lot of our emotions, where we hold on to things. So just focusing on that as a body part. Also, it's the area where the chakra 2 exists. Is just a great way to really have a nice second chakra sequence. So go on and be creative with those poses. I'm so excited for you guys. So thank you so much for being here. Of course, reach out to me through all the social medias, whatever is easier for you. Instagram, LisaLise411. You can email me at lisaDanaMitchell@gmail.com. You can also find me on my Facebook page, Lisa Dana Mitchell, and I would be happy to follow up and answer any questions. Definitely check out any bonuses that I'm including as well, week by week. And you all go on and have a wonderful day. Namaste.